"Mom, sign this. It's time," my son said as he slid the papers across the table on my 72nd birthday. And for a moment, I honestly thought it was a joke, the kind of awkward, poorly timed humor people use when they don't know what else to say. But no one laughed. Not Daniel. Not his wife Emily. Not even my granddaughter, who kept her eyes fixed on her plate, as if the mashed potatoes held something more important than what was happening right in front of her. And that was the first moment I realized this had been planned long before I walked into that dining room with a small smile and a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this year would feel different, that turning 72 would mean something softer, something warmer, something that felt like family instead of a formality. I had spent the morning in my small kitchen baking a vanilla cake from scratch, measuring every cup carefully the way I always had, even though my hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and I remember thinking how strange it was that no one had offered to help, not even Emily, who usually insisted on controlling every detail of these gatherings. But today she had simply told me, "Just come over at 6, Margaret. We'll take care of everything." And I should have noticed the tone, polite but distant, like I was a guest instead of a mother, but I ignored it because that's what I've done for years now. Ignored the small shifts, the subtle changes, the way my place in my own family seemed to shrink little by little until I was standing at the edge of it, looking in, instead of being at the center where I once belonged. And when I arrived at their house that evening, everything looked perfect. The table set with white plates and folded linen napkins, the kind Emily saves for when she wants things to appear just right. Candles lit, soft music playing. Daniel greeting me with a quick hug that felt more like obligation than affection, and I told myself not to read into it, not to overthink it. Because that's what mothers do. We make excuses for our children long after they've stopped making them for us. We sat down to dinner, and for a while, it all seemed normal enough. Small talk. About work, about school, about the weather, conversations that skim the surface and never quite go deep. But there was something underneath it, something quiet and heavy, like everyone was waiting for a cue I hadn't been given. And then, just as I was reaching for my glass of water, Daniel cleared his throat and pulled out a manila folder, placing it carefully in front of me, aligning it with the edge of the table as if precision somehow made it less cruel. And that's when he said it, calm and rehearsed. "Mom, we've been talking about your future, and we think it's time to make some arrangements." And I looked down at the folder, at the neat stack of papers clipped together, my name printed at the top in bold letters, and beneath it, words I never expected to see on my birthday: residential care agreement. And I remember blinking once, then twice, as if my eyes might correct themselves, as if the words would rearrange into something kinder, something that made sense, but they didn't. They stayed exactly as they were, cold and final. And when I looked back up at my son, hoping, just hoping, to see hesitation, doubt, anything that told me this wasn't as serious as it felt, all I saw was resolve. And behind him, Emily stood near the kitchen doorway, arms folded loosely, watching me with a small, controlled smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't concern. This was a decision that had already been made, a plan that had already been set in motion, and I was just now being invited to participate in it, quietly, politely, without making a scene, because that's what they expected from me, that I would nod, that I would accept it, that I would sign without asking too many questions, because to them, I had already become someone who needed to be managed, someone whose life could be reorganized with a stack of papers and a calm voice across a dinner table. And I felt something shift inside me then, not anger, not yet, but a kind of clarity that settled in slowly, like a window finally opening after years of being shut. And instead of pushing the folder away or raising my voice, I simply reached out, placed my hand on the top page, and said, very quietly, "I see." Because sometimes the most important thing you can do in a moment like that is not react at all, but pay attention. I did not open the folder right away. I just kept my hand resting on it as if it were something fragile, something that might break if I moved too quickly. And around me the room continued exactly as before, forks touching plates, glasses being lifted, the quiet clink of silverware filling the space where something else should have been said, something human, something kind, but no one spoke about the papers, not Daniel, not Emily, and certainly not me. And that silence told me more than any explanation ever could, because if this had truly been about concern, about care, they would have talked. They would have reassured me. They would have explained why they thought this was necessary. But instead they let the document speak for them, cold and precise, like a decision already finalized. And I realized then that whatever conversation had needed to happen had taken place without me, days ago, maybe weeks, maybe even months, and I had simply not been included, just like I had not been included in so many small things lately. The weekend plans that I only heard about after the fact, the family dinners that became less frequent, the phone calls that grew shorter and more distant. I had told myself it was normal, that people got busy, that life moved on, but sitting there at that table, with my name printed neatly on a contract that suggested I should leave my home and move into a place designed for people who no longer made their own decisions, I understood that it was not busyness. It was distance, carefully created and quietly maintained. I finally picked up the top page and let my eyes move across the lines. The language was formal, almost polite, speaking of comfort and support and quality of life, phrases that sounded gentle but carried a weight I could feel in my chest. There were details about monthly fees, about personal belongings, about visitation policies, all arranged in a way that made it seem reasonable, even thoughtful, and I almost admired the structure of it. How something so life-altering could be presented as a simple step forward, a practical solution. And when I reached the bottom of the page, there was a blank line waiting for my signature, clean and expectant, as if it had been there all along, just waiting for me to catch up to it. I placed the paper back on the table and folded my hands in my lap, keeping my voice steady when I finally spoke, asking, "When did you decide this?" And Daniel hesitated just long enough for the truth to show before he answered. "We have been thinking about it for a while. Not we, not as a family, not including me, just we," meaning him and Emily, and I nodded slowly, as if that explanation made sense, because in a way it did. It explained everything. The distance, the quiet shifts, the way Emily had started referring to my house as too much for one person, the way Daniel had begun asking questions about my finances that felt casual on the surface but carried a different kind of intent underneath. I looked at him then, really looked at him, at the man he had become, and for a brief moment I could still see the boy who used to hold my hand in grocery stores, who used to ask me to read him one more story before bed. And that memory did not bring comfort the way it used to. It brought clarity, because I could see the distance between who he had been and who he was now. And I realized that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the person he turned to and had become the person he needed to manage. And instead of arguing, instead of pushing back in a way they might expect, I simply gave a small nod and said, "I will need some time to look through this." And Emily's smile tightened just slightly, a nearly invisible reaction. But I saw it. I saw the flicker of impatience behind her calm expression, and that was enough to confirm what I had already begun to suspect. This was not about giving me time. This was about seeing how quickly I would agree, how easily I would step aside. And as the conversation moved on to safer topics, to dessert and polite comments about the cake I had brought, I sat there quietly, listening, observing. And for the first time in a long while, I was not trying to understand their behavior. I was studying it. That night, when I returned to my house, the silence felt different, not heavier, not emptier, just clearer, as if something that had been quietly shifting for years had finally settled into place. And I moved through the familiar room slowly, setting my purse down on the kitchen counter, placing the folder beside it without opening it again, because I already knew what it contained, and more importantly, I knew what it meant. I made myself a cup of tea out of habit, measuring the water, waiting for it to heat, listening to the soft hum of the kettle. And for the first time in a long while, I paid attention to the small details of my own home. The way the light from the overhead fixture reflected off the polished wood table, the faint creak in the floor near the hallway, the framed photographs along the wall that had not been moved in years, each one holding a version of my life that felt both close and distant at the same time. I carried the tea into the living room and sat down in my usual chair, the one Daniel had once insisted was too old to keep. And I remembered how I had smiled back then and said I liked it just fine, how he had laughed and let it go. And now I wondered when those small moments had stopped being conversations and started becoming decisions made without me. I reached for the folder again, this time opening it carefully, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet curiosity, reading each page more slowly, more deliberately, noticing things I had missed before, the address of the facility, the terms of residency, the clause about personal property, and then something that made me pause, a section about the transfer of certain responsibilities, including financial oversight, written in a way that seemed routine at first glance. But the more I read it, the more I understood what it was suggesting, that someone else would begin to manage my accounts, my expenses, my decisions, all under the language of assistance and care, and I felt a small, steady tightening in my chest, not panic, not anger, just recognition, because this was not simply about where I would live, it was about who would be allowed to decide how I lived. I closed the folder gently and set it aside, letting my hands rest in my lap as I thought back over the past year, over the conversations that had seemed harmless at the time, Daniel asking if I had considered downsizing, Emily mentioning how difficult it must be to maintain a house alone, the subtle way they had begun to position the idea as inevitable, as something that would eventually happen, and I had nodded along, agreeing in the abstract without realizing that for them. It had already become concrete, already planned, already scheduled. I stood up and walked down the hallway to my bedroom, opening the top drawer of my dresser where I kept important documents, not because I needed them immediately, but because I suddenly felt the need to see them again, to remind myself of what I had, what I knew, what I had signed, and what I had not. I pulled out the small stack of papers and carried them back to the table, spreading them out carefully, my house deed, my bank statements, the records my husband had always kept so meticulously, and as I looked through them, I noticed something I had not paid attention to before, small transfers, consistent amounts, accounts I recognized but had never fully examined, and I realized how much I had trusted without question, how much I had allowed to exist in the background of my life. Without understanding it, I sat there for a long time, the clock on the wall ticking steadily, marking each second with quiet precision, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt focused, because for the first time since that dinner, I was no longer reacting to what had been presented to me. I was beginning to ask my own questions, not out loud, not yet, but clearly, deliberately. And as I gathered the papers back into a neat stack, placing them beside the folder Daniel had given me, I understood something simple but important. Whatever they believed about my future, whatever plans they had already made, they were working with an assumption, and assumptions, I have learned, are only as strong as the information they are built on, and I was no longer certain they had all of it. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already begun organizing itself before I even opened my eyes. And there was a quiet steadiness to that feeling that I had not experienced in a long time. I made my way to the kitchen and prepared breakfast the same way I always did. One slice of toast, a cup of coffee, a small dish of fruit, nothing elaborate, nothing rushed, just routine. And as I sat at the table, I allowed my thoughts to move back through the years, not in a sentimental way, but in a deliberate one, tracing the small changes that had led to where I was now. I remembered when Daniel first married Emily, how attentive she had been in the beginning, always asking questions, always offering help, the kind of kindness that feels genuine until you realize it comes with a purpose. And at the time, I had been grateful that my son had found someone who seemed capable and organized, someone who could build a stable life with him. And perhaps that was where it began, not the problem itself, but my willingness to trust it without question, because over time, her involvement shifted, slowly, carefully, from helping to directing, from suggesting to deciding. And Daniel, who had always been easygoing, had followed that shift without resistance, not because he intended harm, but because it was easier. And I could see now how those small patterns had built on each other, one decision leading to another. Until my voice was no longer part of the process, I finished my coffee and stood up, taking my dishes to the sink, rinsing them with the same measured movements. And then I returned to the table where the folder still sat, unopened since the night before, beside my own documents, and I looked at them together for a moment, two sets of information, two different versions of what my future could be, one written for me, the other built over years without anyone needing to explain it to me. And instead of feeling conflicted, I felt something else, something clearer, because I understood now that the situation was not about convincing them they were wrong. It was about understanding exactly what they believed to be true. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in quite some time. Harold Bennett, my late husband's attorney, a man who had always spoken carefully, never wasting words. And for a brief moment, I hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of recognition that this call would shift things in a way that could not be undone. Then I pressed the button and listened as the line rang. Once, twice, before his voice answered, steady and familiar. "Margaret, it has been a while." And I found that my own voice matched his tone when I replied, calm and direct, explaining that I needed to review some documents and understand my current position. I did not mention the dinner. I did not mention Daniel or Emily. I simply asked for clarity, and he agreed to meet that afternoon, without hesitation, as if he had been expecting this call at some point. And when I ended the conversation, I set the phone down and allowed myself a small pause, not to second guess, but to acknowledge that something had already begun to shift. I gathered the folder and my papers, placing them neatly into my bag, checking once more that everything was in order. And as I moved through the house, turning off lights, adjusting curtains, preparing to leave, I felt a quiet certainty settle in, not about the outcome, not yet, but about the process itself, because whatever assumptions Daniel and Emily had made, whatever conclusions they had already reached, they had done so without one important piece. They had assumed I would not look closely. They had assumed I would not ask questions. And more than anything, they had assumed that I no longer understood how to protect what was mine. And as I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was not reacting to their decisions. I was beginning to make my own. I arrived at Harold Bennett's office 10 minutes early, something my husband used to insist on, and I found myself sitting in the small reception area with my hands folded neatly over my bag, watching the quiet movement of people coming and going, each of them focused on their own business, their own concerns, and it struck me how ordinary everything felt, how nothing about the outside world reflected the shift that had taken place in my own life just the night before, when my son had placed a future in front of me that I had not chosen. And when Harold finally stepped out to greet me, his expression was the same as I remembered, composed, attentive, with a slight nod that acknowledged both familiarity and purpose. He led me into his office, closing the door gently behind us, and without unnecessary conversation, I placed the folder on his desk alongside my own documents, explaining in simple terms that I wanted to understand exactly what I was being asked to agree to, and more importantly, what I already had in place. He adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the papers one by one, his movements precise, unhurried, and I watched him closely, not searching for reassurance, but for accuracy. Because I had learned by now that what mattered was not how something felt, but what it actually meant. After several minutes, he set the nursing home contract aside and turned his attention fully to the documents I had brought, the ones my husband had organized years ago with a level of care I had not fully appreciated at the time. And as he flipped through them, I noticed a subtle change in his expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition, as if he was confirming something he already suspected. He asked me a few questions about whether anything had been updated recently, whether I had signed any new agreements or authorized any changes, and I answered truthfully, explaining that I had not made any decisions beyond routine matters, that I had trusted the structure that had been set in place. And when he finally leaned back in his chair, he folded his hands together and looked directly at me, not with concern, but with clarity, and said, "Margaret, based on what I see here, you remain the sole owner of your home, and you retain full control over your financial accounts and assets." And I felt a quiet stillness settle over me, not relief, not yet, but confirmation, because what he was saying aligned with what I had begun to suspect, that whatever Daniel and Emily believed, whatever assumptions they had built their plan around, they were not working with the complete picture. Harold continued, explaining that there were additional protections in place, arrangements my husband had established that ensured decisions regarding my residence and finances could not be transferred without my explicit consent. And he spoke about them in practical terms, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a matter of fact, something that had always existed, whether I had paid attention to it or not. I listened carefully, asking only a few questions, enough to understand the structure, the boundaries, the points at which control could and could not shift. and with each answer, the situation became less abstract and more defined. I could see the outline of what had been attempted, not fully, not completely, but enough to understand the direction. And when I asked him about the contract itself, about whether there was any obligation on my part to proceed, he gave a simple answer. No, there is none, not unless you choose to sign it. And that was all I needed to hear. I gathered my papers slowly, placing them back into my bag with the same care I had used when I first brought them. And as I stood to leave, Harold added one more thing, not as a warning, but as a reminder, that situations like this often developed gradually, that they relied on assumptions and expectations, rather than direct confrontation. And I nodded, because I understood that now, more clearly than I had before. And as I stepped back out into the afternoon light, the air felt the same as it always had, steady and familiar, but there was something different in the way I moved through it, something more deliberate, because I was no longer trying to make sense of what had been presented to me. I was beginning to see it for what it was, and more importantly, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided for me, it would be decided by me. When I returned home that afternoon, I did not rush to do anything. I placed my bag on the same spot by the kitchen counter, took off my coat, and moved through the house with a calm that felt unfamiliar but steady, as if something inside me had finally aligned with the reality I was facing. I set the documents back on the table, separating the nursing home contract from my own papers, placing them side by side again. But this time, they did not feel equal. One was an attempt, the other was fact, and that distinction mattered more than anything. I made myself another cup of coffee, not because I needed it, but because routine has a way of grounding decisions. And as I stood there waiting for the machine to finish, I thought about what Harold had said, not just the words themselves, but the tone, the certainty, the absence of doubt. There had been no hesitation when he explained my position, no warning that I might lose control, no suggestion that I was already too late, and that told me everything I needed to know. Whatever Daniel and Emily believed they were doing, they were operating on incomplete information, and that meant they would continue moving forward with confidence, assuming I would follow the path they had laid out. And that assumption, I realized, was not something I needed to correct immediately. I carried my coffee to the table and sat down, pulling the contract closer, reading it once more, this time not as someone being pressured, but as someone evaluating a strategy. I paid attention to the language again, the timing, the expectations, the subtle way it positioned agreement as the natural next step, and I could almost see the conversation that had led to it. Emily outlining the plan, Daniel agreeing, perhaps hesitating at first, but ultimately convinced that this was practical, that this was necessary, that this was the responsible thing to do. And I did not need to imagine anger or cruelty to understand it, because sometimes decisions like this are not made out of malice, but out of convenience, out of a belief that someone else's life can be simplified for the sake of your own. I let out a slow breath and reached for a pen, not to sign, but to hold, to feel the weight of it in my hand, because that small action carried more meaning than they realized. They expected a signature, they expected compliance. They expected a quiet transition from one life into another. And for a moment, I allowed myself to consider what would happen if I gave them exactly what they expected, not the result, but the appearance of it. I set the pen down again and leaned back in my chair, letting the idea settle, because there is a difference between refusing something outright and understanding it completely before responding. And I was beginning to see the advantage of that difference. I stood up and walked toward the living room, picking up my phone along the way, scrolling through recent messages until I found the one from Daniel. A simple follow-up from that morning asking if I had looked over the paperwork, the kind of message that sounds casual but carries a quiet urgency beneath it. I read it once, then set the phone down without replying, not out of avoidance, but because timing matters, and I was no longer interested in reacting on their schedule. I moved to the window and looked out at the street, at the same houses I had seen every day for years. Nothing had changed out there. But inside, something had shifted completely. I understood now that this was not just about a document or a decision. It was about control, about who held it and who was assumed to have lost it. And for the first time since that dinner, I felt certain of one thing. I was not going to argue. I was not going to explain. And I was certainly not going to rush, because whatever they thought they had set in motion, I was the one who would decide how it ended. The following morning, I decided to respond, Not with explanation, not with resistance, but with something much simpler. I picked up my phone and typed a short message to Daniel, keeping my tone even, almost neutral. I have reviewed the documents. We should discuss this properly. Perhaps dinner this weekend. And I read it once before sending it, not to adjust the words, but to confirm the intention behind them, because every word now carried weight, every pause, every delay, and within minutes, his reply came through, quicker than usual, as if he had been waiting. Of course, Mom. That sounds good. We can go over everything together. And I could almost hear the relief in that sentence. The assumption that I was moving in the direction they had planned, that I was cooperating, and I set the phone down without responding further, allowing that assumption to remain exactly as it was, because there is a certain advantage in being underestimated, in allowing others to believe the outcome is already decided. The rest of the day passed quietly. I went through my usual routines, watering the plants, checking the mail, folding laundry, small tasks that grounded the hours without demanding much thought. But beneath those actions, my mind remained steady, organized, not racing, not uncertain, just attentive. And later that afternoon, I made one more call, this time to my bank, not to question anything directly, but to confirm access, to ensure that everything Harold had described was still exactly as it should be. The representative on the line was polite, professional, walking me through the details without hesitation, confirming account ownership, confirming permissions, confirming that no changes had been made without my authorization, and I listened carefully, not because I expected something different, but because confirmation matters, facts matter, and when the call ended, I wrote down a few notes, simple, clear, placing them alongside my documents in a folder of my own, separate from the one Daniel had given me. Because it felt important to create that distinction, one set of papers represented their plan, the other represented my reality, and by evening, everything was in place, not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that anyone else could see, but in a way that gave me clarity, and clarity, I have learned, is far more powerful than urgency. The next day, Emily called, which was unusual. She rarely reached out directly unless there was something specific she wanted to manage. Her voice was light, controlled, asking how I was doing, mentioning the dinner Daniel had arranged, and there was a carefulness in her tone, a kind of measured politeness that felt practiced, as if she were checking for signs, looking for any indication that I might resist, and I responded just as carefully, keeping my voice steady, saying that I was looking forward to seeing them, that I appreciated their concern, and there was a brief pause on the line, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough for me to notice, before she replied with a small agreement. And when the call ended, I set the phone down and allowed myself a moment of stillness, because everything was moving exactly as expected, not because I had forced it, but because I had not disrupted it. And that was the key. I was not stepping into their plan. I was allowing it to unfold, observing it, understanding it fully before making my own move. And as I looked at the folder on the table, the one with the contract waiting patiently inside, I realized that they believed this was a process they controlled, a conversation they had already shaped. But what they did not realize was that I had already stepped outside of it, quietly, deliberately, and that the dinner they were preparing for would not be the conclusion they were expecting. It would be. The moment everything became clear, just not in the way they intended. By the time the weekend arrived, everything had settled into a quiet rhythm, not because anything had been resolved, but because each piece was now exactly where it needed to be. And as I prepared to leave for dinner, I moved with the same care I had always taken on important occasions, choosing a simple navy dress, brushing my hair slowly, fastening the small pair of earrings my husband had given me years ago, not out of sentiment, but out of habit, because there is a certain strength in maintaining who you are, even when everything around you suggests you should become something else. I gathered my bag, making sure the folder I had prepared was inside, separate from the one Daniel had given me. And as I closed the front door behind me, I felt no hesitation, only a steady awareness of what was about to unfold. When I arrived at their house, everything appeared just as it had before, the table set neatly, the lighting soft, the atmosphere carefully arranged to feel comfortable, familiar, and Emily greeted me at the door with the same controlled warmth, her smile measured, her tone polite, asking how I had been, as if The conversation from days before had simply been another routine discussion, and I responded in kind, offering the same calm politeness. Because consistency has a way of disarming expectation. Daniel joined us a moment later, his expression slightly more attentive than usual, watching me in a way that suggested he was searching for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps confirmation, and I gave him neither. We sat down to dinner, and for a while, the conversation followed the same pattern as before: light topics, safe observations, the kind of exchanges that fill space without saying anything of importance. But beneath it, there was a tension that had not been there before, not visible, not spoken, but present, like a quiet current running beneath the surface, and eventually, as expected, Daniel reached for the folder he had given me, placing it gently on the table between us, aligning it carefully as if that gesture made the moment more orderly. "Have you had a chance to look everything over?" he asked, his voice even, but slightly tighter than before, and I nodded once, not rushing, not hesitating, simply acknowledging the question. "Yes, I have," I said, keeping my tone steady, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. As if the room itself were waiting for the next step, Emily leaned back slightly, her hands folded in her lap, watching closely, her expression composed but attentive, and I reached into my bag, not for their folder, but for my own, placing it on the table with the same care, the same precision, and I noticed the subtle shift in both of their expressions, not alarm, not yet, but curiosity, because this was not part of what they had planned. I opened my folder slowly, removing a few documents and setting them in front of me, not pushing them forward, not presenting them dramatically, just placing them there as part of the conversation. And then I looked at Daniel, meeting his eyes in a way I had not done in quite some time, not with accusation, not with anger, but with clarity. "I did review what you gave me," I said, my voice calm, measured, "and I also took some time to review what I already have." And I let that sentence sit for a moment, not to create tension, but to allow it to be understood, because understanding does not always come from volume. Sometimes it comes from stillness. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly to the papers in front of me, then back to my face, and I could see the first trace of uncertainty begin to form, small, almost unnoticeable, but present, and Emily's posture changed slightly, her shoulders drawing in just enough to suggest that something had moved outside the boundaries she had anticipated, and I continued, not raising my voice, not changing my tone, simply speaking as someone who had taken the time to understand her position. "There are a few things I would like to clarify before we move forward." And in that moment, I realized that the conversation had already shifted, not because I had challenged them directly, but because I had stepped into it on my own terms. And for the first time since this began, I was not responding to their plan. I was defining the direction of the discussion myself. I did not rush to fill the silence after my last sentence. I simply let it remain, steady and present, because silence, when used carefully, has a way of revealing more than words ever could. And Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, his hand resting near the folder he had brought, as if unsure whether to open it again or leave it where it was, while Emily's eyes moved briefly across the documents in front of me, calculating, measuring, trying to understand what she had not anticipated, and I could see it clearly now, not confusion, but disruption, the kind that happens when a plan meets something it did not account for. I reached for one of my papers and turned it slightly so it faced them, not pushing it across the table, just allowing it to be visible. And I spoke in the same calm tone I had used from the beginning. "I met with Harold Bennett," I said, watching their reactions carefully, and there it was, that subtle shift again, Daniel's expression tightening just enough to register the name, Emily's posture becoming more alert, more controlled, because they both understood what that meant, not emotionally, but structurally. It meant I had not simply read their document, I had verified my own position, and that changed everything. He helped me review everything. I continued, my home, my accounts, the arrangements that were put in place years ago, and I paused just long enough to let the words settle, not for effect, but for clarity, because clarity does not need to be forced, it simply needs to be presented. Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before returning to me, and in that moment, I saw something I had not seen before, not authority, not certainty, but hesitation, the kind that comes when confidence is built on incomplete understanding. Emily, however, remained composed, her voice measured when she finally spoke. "We are only trying to make sure you are taken care of," she said, and her words were carefully chosen, reasonable on the surface, but I had learned by now to listen to what was beneath them, and I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "I understand that," I replied. "But being taken care of does not mean giving up control," and I let that distinction stand on its own. Because it did not require explanation, I placed my hand lightly on my documents, not as a protective gesture, but as a simple acknowledgement of their presence. "There are protections in place," I said, "that ensure any decisions about my home or my finances remain mine to make." And this time, I did not need to watch for their reaction to know it had landed. The shift in the room was immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable. The conversation had moved from suggestion to boundary, from assumption to fact. Daniel leaned back slightly, his shoulders no longer as firm as before, his voice quieter when he spoke. "Mom, we just thought it might be easier." And I looked at him then, not with disappointment, not with anger, but with a kind of clarity that comes from finally understanding something fully. "Easier for who?" I asked, not sharply, not accusingly, just plainly, and he did not answer right away, because there was no easy way to answer that question without revealing what had been left unspoken. Emily stepped in then, her tone still controlled but more direct. "This is about planning ahead," she said, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the point without yielding to it. "Then we will plan," I replied, "but we will do it correctly." And I closed my folder slowly, not as a conclusion, but as a signal, because the direction had been set, the boundaries had been made clear, and whatever they had expected from this evening, it was no longer possible. Not because I had raised my voice or refused outright, but because I had done something far more decisive. I had understood, and in doing so, I had taken back the one thing they had assumed I no longer held, the ability to decide what happens next.